Good morning, and thank you for joining the Extended Day Ahead Market Stakeholder Working Group Debrief meeting. I'm Christina Osborne, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs Group, and I'll be facilitating the meeting. And just a few reminders before I review the agenda. We are recording this session and we'll post the video file on the main EDAM initiative webpage, where you'll find the presentation and other documents related to that initiative. The recordings and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. We will stop and take questions throughout the presentation, and I will provide instructions at that time for how to raise your hand. Once the event producer has unmuted your line, please start by introducing yourself by name and affiliation. So after my introduction, Elliot Mainzer, President and CEO, and Mark Rothletter, Senior Vice President and COO here at the ISO, will provide opening remarks. Then Milos Vasanik, the EDAM policy lead, and Phil Pettengill, who served as the working group coordinator, will provide an overview of the EDAM stakeholder process, which includes the working group activities. And then the working group facilitators, Mark Richardson, Deb Levine, and Kevin Head, will give updates on the working group discussions. Then Therese Hampton, who is the chair of the WEIM Governance Review Committee, will provide a brief update on activities related to that effort. And then to close out the presentation, Milos and I will discuss upcoming activities in the EDAM stakeholder process. The objective of this debrief is to identify the next stage in the EDAM stakeholder process, share a comprehensive progress update and impressions across all three working groups, and describe the emerging framework design coming out of those working groups. So with that, I'd like to turn the meeting over to Elliot Mainzer and Mark Rothletter to provide opening remarks, starting with Elliot.
Thanks, Christina, and good morning, everybody. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I wanted to take a few minutes just at the start of the meeting, just really first and foremost, just to thank everybody. I know this has been a huge lift these first 3 months of March. Thank you so much to everybody that's been participating in our process. Thanks to all the team here at the ISO. Folks have been working really hard. It's been a big lift. And I think for us, we've adopted, I think, a very clearly a very open and inclusive stakeholder process, right? I think we want to try to harness the collective wisdom of the West in designing the extended day ahead market. So we've got our utilities and our IPPs, and both from the environmental community, our regulators. It's really important that we hear all of those voices and really try to synthesize the very, very best information we possibly can into this design. And we're still operating in a complex environment in the West, right? We've got still a lot of BA balkanization. Everybody's sort of coming to the table with their own individual interests and needs and preferences. And I think the goal, and I think that we've already started to see this behavior modeled really well, is to try to find multilateral solutions to all those challenges. And I really appreciate everybody leaning in and working through, what are admittedly sometimes some very complex and difficult issues. So thanks again. I think just Milos reminded, I think we've had 60 working group meetings, 120 hours of meetings, 273 registrants, and 107 different companies represented. So hopefully you guys feel well represented and well heard. And now, of course, the next phase, our team's going to go back and try to do a really fabulous job sort of synthesizing all of the great input that's come through this first phase and come back with the straw proposal towards the end of April. And I think the challenge will be to sort of consolidate our gains. We'll hear some about that today and really try to pull together the areas where we think we've got real agreement and real clarity. And then, of course, delineate those areas where we still have work to do. And I think those topic areas will define some of the nature of the interaction, even the way we pull ourselves back together again to continue working and collaborating as we finalize the design across the course of the year. Of course, at the same time, and we're fortunate we'll hear from Therese Hampton a little bit later, the governance issues, which are so essential, will continue to evolve as well. And so I'm I've watched the Governance Review Committee in action over the last year. They're really an incredible group of folks who've got some new additions, great representation. I know they've already had a round of feedback to start thinking about, and I'm very confident that Therese and the whole GRC group will be able to get us to the right place for the next step in the governance evolution as well. And so we're really excited for the next phase. It's going to be an intense few weeks here, sort of pulling together all of your input, but we're really excited to put out, I think, a very solid market design. Look, I want to point out, our expectation here is, we are definitely going to be putting out a very substantive and actionable design for EDAM. We're not talking about pilots, we're talking about the real thing, and we really want to make sure that this design has all the core elements for being actionable. But in the same way that the EIM has evolved over the last 7 or 8 years, we expect that there will be elements of EDAM that will continue to evolve, and we want to get a design that's actionable for market participants, but we also don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? We know that we'll learn about how our systems evolve in the EDAM environment. We'll learn about transmission, we'll learn about policy issues. There'll be a lot of elements that will continue to evolve and adapt over time. But at the end of the day, we're just the last couple of weeks, we were obviously super pleased just to welcome 2 new EIM participants in Avista and Tacoma. We're coming up on the $2 billion benefit mark for EIM, which has just really been such a success story, and really shown both the power and the value of working together across that broad footprint. And I'm just really excited to take the next step together and build on these relationships and continue to evolve and take that next step towards a fully integrated market in the West. So thanks again to all of you for your participation, for your partnership, and just really looking forward to today and the next steps. And with that, I will turn it over to our Senior Vice President, Chief Operating Officer, Mark Rothleader. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Elliot, and thanks for those opening words. So, look at the use of the work groups in such an intense manner that we did is new to the ISO. Our goal of this was to have an inclusive and open process that would be robust in exposing and bringing forward views from across the West, as Elliot indicated. And I think we largely accomplished that, at least in the areas that we had the work group so far. We attempted to rely on staff to facilitate and document that was different staff than our normal policy and technology resources. That allowed our our technology resources and our policy experts to actually engage in the discussions, allowing them to actually explore, debate ideas along with the stakeholders. The objective was not to finalize policy or implement ideas at this point, but rather listen and foster ideas. For the most part, the work groups achieved what I had hoped that they would. It reached an exchange and development of ideas over a broad range, but maybe in varying depths of the identified topics within the critical design areas of resource efficiency, confidence, transmission provisioning, and GHG tracking and accounting. I observed as the work group discussions evolved from understanding, level setting, to ideation, to debating, to pressure testing, the substance, the capacity for the work groups under the pace and the remote constraints to sustain good listening practices became increasingly challenging. That said, I feel the last days of the work group's activity reinforced for me that the process ultimately worked well, as I observed individual ideas and thoughts coming together as the group took broader views and to identify connectivity of ideas, constraints on the design, and identification of remaining gaps and thoughts how to overcome those gaps. The collective information is a rich set of material for the development of a straw proposal. We will not get it right the first time, and the straw proposal itself will develop through the stakeholder process. But I can confidently say that the straw proposal, the comprehensive straw proposal, and the ultimate design of will greatly benefit from the work group process that occurred. Let me just briefly kind of do a high-level flyover of what I think the overall objectives and maybe some of the things that the groups tried to achieve. In the resource efficiency area, I think that the overall objective was trying to leverage the put together a process where individual good utility practices and processes leading up to the real time result in creating a collective confidence and benefit, not just economic benefit, but also a coordination and reliability benefit for all those who participate in the EDAM. In the transmission area, I think really the objective there was how to effectively, efficiently, and appropriately gain the benefits of resource and load diversity across the West by effectively using the connective tissue of the system, the transmission system itself. And we've talked about a lot of things, but that efficiency and effective use, on the one hand, is kind of grounded in, well, how do we minimize pancaking of rates and getting to that efficient dispatch? But at the same time, we have to be cognizant that there have to be appropriate and needed compensation, ensure compensation for transmission, and also make sure that the transmission rights are being honored in that endeavor. And then lastly, in the GHG, it's really, it's very straightforward, but complex to implement, but how to track and accurately account for GHG in a manner that respects individual states and their development of individual clean energy policies. And there is different policies in different states. There are some states that do not have a GHG regulation policy. And yet we still have to have a marketplace that works effectively across that entire footprint. I think there's a lot of good ideas, two ideas that have developed, a source specific and a zonal approach. And I look forward to continuing to explore those in the straw proposal. We talk about these three particular items that were the point of work group debate. We know that there is a broader set of topics that have to come together in the comprehensive straw proposal. And there are other things that feed into the overall EDAM operation that we will still continue to have to develop, whether it be price formation or things like resource efficiency and so forth. So those are works in progress. Those are things that we'll be talking about a little bit as well. But I look forward to the discussion today, not at a detailed work group level, but across the work groups and how effective and where they feel they have gotten to in terms of addressing the issues that they intended to, and the broad range of input that is now going to be used to coalesce into a straw proposal. I'll just end with a real thank you. Thank you to all the stakeholders. Every time I looked and monitored the work groups, there were over 100 participants on the line. This is not easy to do in a remote mode, but we maintained a robust engagement, and I appreciate that commitment. And I also want to say thank you to the ISO staff, the facilitators. This was not their main job, and they committed their time and their resources to facilitate. I've received good feedback so far that the facilitation was fair and open, and we will be doing a review and seeking feedback on that. But I just want to say thank you again to everybody for their time and their commitment, and look forward to the rest of the process. With that, I will turn it back to who?
Christina.
Okay.
Thank you, Elliot. I really appreciate it. So next up, we do have Milos Bosonic and Phil Pettengill, who will provide an overview of ISO stakeholder, the EDAM stakeholder process. So Milos, go ahead.
Good morning, Christina. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
All right. Good morning, and thank you again, everybody, for joining us today as we mark the conclusion to the working groups. Let me just turn on my camera here. All right, here we go. Okay, it works. But we started the working groups, as Mark said, as part of a new process to leverage really stakeholder input, perspectives, and ideas early on in the process to help us shape the EDAM design. And really, after a long 2.5 months, we have marked the conclusion to these working groups, and I'm certainly appreciative of all of your engagement, time, and effort. I do want to acknowledge as well that we had a number of stakeholders as well take ownership and put together presentations and thought through concepts that they presented to the broader working groups, and we're certainly appreciative of them taking that time as well. So very good discussion, I think, over the last 2.5 months across all 3 of the working groups. We do have a number of important topics on the agenda today, so I'll briefly cover kind of where we're going in the EDAM process timeline, where we are, where we're going, and we'll also cover the steps to the straw proposal. Then Phil, who's our working group coordinator, will then take stock of the working group phase, provide his perspective on those, and that we concluded those yesterday, and we'll share some of the statistics to really acknowledge and put into perspective the time and effort put into our collective discussions. We're then going to move to the working group briefings for each one of the working groups, and we'll pause for questions, observations from stakeholders regarding each one of those working groups now that we've concluded them. I really encourage you to take a moment and share your perspectives and feedback. We really want to learn from this process and learn how best to improve it going down the road. And you know, you'll see a bit later as well, we're planning on, we'll be introducing a survey around these working groups to solicit more broadly that feedback, and we'll talk a bit about that as well towards the end. But we also will hear from Therese Hampton, who's the chair of the GRC, to provide an update on the EDAM governance effort and opportunities to engage there as well. And that will be coming a bit later in the discussion. And then after Therese is done, I'm going to come back and have a little bit more of a focused discussion on the straw proposal and what to expect in that straw proposal as we start synthesizing the feedback that we heard from the working groups. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, I'll just spend a couple of minutes just on this slide. I think you're hopefully familiar with it by now, but this is the overall process timeline for the EDAM. And as we start the discussions, I just want to highlight where we are in the overall design process at the conclusion of the working groups. As you know, we started the working groups in early January, and we concluded them yesterday, kind of mid-March. And now the next step is moving to the development of that comprehensive straw proposal, taking into account that input that we've heard and those perspectives and ideas that we've heard across the working groups. We will move through iterations of the straw proposal, ultimately to target a briefing to the ISO board and the Western EIM governing body in December of 2022. But we are committed to continuing to evaluate this timeline as we move through the process, informed by that stakeholder feedback. And as we discussed before, 2023 then is expected to be dedicated to implementation activities, filing of the proposal with FERC, and then targeting the ability to launch the EDAM in 2024. In parallel to that design effort, we also have, again, the Western EIM Governance Review Committee undertaking a process on EDAM governance design. And like I said, we're going to hear a little bit about that today from Therese when she provides an update from the GRC. So let's go to the next slide, please. Mark mentioned this a little bit, that there's some interdependencies with other initiatives, and I do want to take stock and acknowledge other important initiatives that have connections to the EDAM effort. I think we've been able to tease out some of these aspects throughout the working groups, but I just do want to take stock and recognize that there are interdependencies that we are cognizant of and that we will all need to keep in mind as we go through this process. Throughout the stakeholder working groups in discussing different topics, we've also discussed the connections to the day-ahead market enhancements initiative that's currently going on in parallel. Some of those enhancements that are being considered in that initiative are important considerations in the EDAM that we will continue evaluating as we move through the stakeholder process. I also want to acknowledge that we also have the Western EIM Resource Sufficiency Evaluation Initiative that's going on. We have a couple of phases that I think we're looking at merging, but phase 2 of that initiative, which is continuing to evaluate enhancements to the resource sufficiency evaluation in the EIM. But we do need to continue to be mindful of the interdependencies between the EDAM and the Western EIM, how certain actions in the EDAM will flow into the EIM, how those will be reflected in the EIM, especially as we consider the concept of resource sufficiency and consequences of failing the resource sufficiency evaluation in the day-ahead time frame. What implications may that have on the real-time resource sufficiency evaluation itself? It'll be important to continue considering those implications and those impacts between those two efforts and between the two resource sufficiency frameworks, between the day-ahead and the real-time. We've been able, like I said, in the working groups to start teasing out some of those connections and the potential implications of when certain things are done in the day-ahead time frame and how that resource sufficiency evaluation is shaped. What implications may that have in the real-time and the resource sufficiency evaluation? I also want to acknowledge that we do have the transmission service and market scheduling priorities initiative as well going on in parallel at this time that is looking to develop a reservation process for establishing wheel-through priorities across the ISO system. And that initiative, again, is moving on in parallel, and we're mindful of needing to consider those tie-ins to the EDAM and those implications, particularly in the transmission context. And finally, but not least, I do want to acknowledge the Price Formation Enhancements Initiative, which we'll be launching in April. This initiative will explore several topics that are related to price formation, including the concept of fast start pricing, scarcity pricing, with implications for the EDAM. One of the common design principles, if we think back to when we started the EDAM effort, one of the common design principles acknowledge the importance of considering price formation issues by doing so in parallel with the EDAM effort, acknowledging that those particular topics, while important to the EDAM, are not necessarily unique to the EDAM. And so that's why we recognize the connections, but we will be taking on that in parallel to the EDAM design process. And you can expect that to launch again in April. So we do want to acknowledge that there's a number of interdependencies. This is a large and sizable effort, the development of the EDAM design, and we're cognizant of connections to other initiatives that I think we'll all continue working on. And we will also dedicate time in the straw proposal to acknowledge more deeply some of those interdependencies and interconnections between initiatives. Let's go to the next slide, please. And just in the interest of time, I'm going to briefly touch on this more granular timeline. We will come back to this towards the end when I talk about the pathway to the straw proposal. But I wanted to touch briefly on this more detailed timeline of milestones. I want to acknowledge that we have reached an important milestone, as we've been noting here, of completing the stage of the working groups in this early part of the stakeholder process. As we've noted before, we're open to bringing back more discrete and more focused working groups, I think, throughout the stakeholder process as necessary on particular topics. But I think we've marked an important milestone in the conclusion of these working groups at the start of the process. And I'll talk a little bit more about this towards the end of the meeting, but I think we're in much better place having held these working groups over the last 2.5 months. We're in much better place in putting forward a straw proposal. We're in much better place, hopefully, from the stakeholder community and having a better understanding of the number of different issues and interdependencies between topics that I think it will bear fruit once we publish that straw proposal, because I think having developed that collective understanding, I think it will allow for more informed comments, and I think it also helps us move forward in that stakeholder process through different iterations of the proposals. But with the working groups concluded, now we move on to that next stage, which is that straw proposal stage, where we will be developing a comprehensive proposal really informed by all of those discussions and feedback that we received in the working groups. I recognize that with the brisk pacing of the working groups and the amount of topics covered, there's been limited opportunity for kind of more formalized comments along the way. We've certainly encouraged stakeholders to speak orally in those working group meetings, share perspectives kind of in real time and reactions and ideas to some of the topics. But we do recognize that there's a need for a larger opportunity to provide more formal feedback, and that's really what we're hoping to achieve through the comprehensive straw proposal, where we will be bringing these ideas and concepts that we've heard in the working groups and synthesizing that larger straw proposal that the stakeholders will have opportunity to consider as a whole and provide more formal feedback and written stakeholder comments. I do anticipate that this will be a lengthy straw proposal, and we try to acknowledge that through a longer comment period as well. You know, we're targeting publication of the straw proposal the last week of April, and then I anticipate we're going to have 2 days of stakeholder meetings on the on us presenting the straw proposal and going through slides to share more in detail that straw proposal. And then we will also be allowing for a bit more time for stakeholder comments. So let me pause here, and maybe let me turn it over to Phil. He has a couple of slides to go over, and then there may be an opportunity there to pause to take comments. So Phil, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Milos. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, great. Well, good morning, everybody. And again, as we've heard from Elliot, Mark, and Milos, great accomplishment getting through the work group process here, and a heck of a way to launch a new year, right? What I thought I would do is just take a minute and reflect on what we have accomplished. And we heard a little bit of these kind of numbers from Elliot, just highlighting a few things to point out here. It was really exciting for us to see that we had well over 100 attendees in each of the work group meetings, and we certainly recognize that was a major commitment by all of you that were participating, because it's not only those 120 hours that we spent going through those work group meetings, but recognizing that there was a significant amount of time and effort that all of you took just in, frankly, trying to keep up with us and us trying to keep up with you and just be prepared for each of those 2-hour sessions. Lots of companies represented. We really appreciate the breadth of folks that were at least listening in and keeping up with that dialogue. And so, as Milos mentioned, with the straw proposal coming out, look forward to you leveraging what we heard from you in the work groups and then applying your expertise as we go through our normal stakeholder process for the remainder of this year that'll be based on that straw proposal. Let's move to the next slide in the interest of time here and just say what I wanted to do as the work group coordinator is just take stock on what we saw, and hopefully you agree, happened here over the next 2.5 months. And we heard this from Mark in his opening comments and Elliot as well, that we really believe the work group process was very productive. Lots of open discussion, new ideas, and new concepts, but certainly helped expand the breadth and depth of the ISO view on these issues. And as I think most of us know, that's historically been a bit of a challenge for us in terms of making sure we identify what are the issues that need to be solved, and then we can all start to focus on possible solutions for those. So to just take a minute or two on this slide, what I wanted to do was sort of reflect on the fact that we had the facilitated stakeholder process. The discussion was intentionally led by what we saw as an independent ISO person who was not necessarily invested in the policy design, but could actually draw from the ISO policy experts as well as all of you as we were trying to have that dialogue. So their effort was to, in fact, seek out agreement and look for key points. Where we needed to, we did review and we did modify any of the scope items that we all started with, and we appreciate those thoughts and ideas. But more importantly, had an opportunity to really delve into the substance. And I characterize it this way only from the standpoint that we think that the work groups are something that is very productive and something we want to add to our tool bag when it comes to policy development at the California ISO. As we went through that discussion, we needed to capture it. We needed to at least make sure that we were hearing you and give you an opportunity to review what we thought we heard. And so we then established the weekly reports and tried to capture what were the key discussion points in that week. And I think we can probably anticipate we would continue to do that as we go through a work group process. We post those reports. We also posted the recordings because we understood that sometimes all of us have busy schedules and we can't necessarily sit in on the whole meeting or sometimes have to miss a meeting, but at least gives us an opportunity to go back and review what was said. Looking to now capture all of that discussion, our real challenge is how do we write a summary report that covers all of this dialogue that we've had, that 120 hours worth of meetings and a lot of those good ideas. So look for that. And that's really what I wanted to wrap up with here is say, look for that summary report coming out next week. Honestly, it'll probably be the end of the week, but we are intentionally designing a summary report for each of the work groups so we can at least capture what we think are the high points and some of the points that were under discussion from all of you. The last thing I wanted to mention, and you'll hear more about this from Christina as we wrap up this morning, but we are going to put out a work group survey, a customer survey to all of you. And really, what we want to do here is say what were the pluses, what were the minuses? How can we do a little bit of a delta plus minus delta check on the value of the work groups? We certainly recognize that the pace that we all just went through over the last 11 weeks was much faster and much more rigorous than we would imagine on a going forward basis. When we think about use of work groups on a more typical policy design, I think all of you appreciate that EDAM necessitated us to really put this push in these first few months of this year. But on a going forward basis, I think you've got our understanding that work groups would certainly be at a different pace and stretched out over a longer period of time rather than the compressed schedule that we had here. So let me stop there, hand it back to you, Milos, and maybe Christina. I know we're going to do a little bit of Q&A at this point in the presentation. I know we're slipping a little bit in terms of our overall schedule, but maybe see if there are any questions. If not, we can move on with our discussion for the morning.
Sure. Yeah, so if you have a question, if you logged into WebEx, select the hand icon located above the chat window. If you just dialed into the meeting, you're going to want to press #2 on your phone. And just a reminder to please introduce yourself after your line is unmuted. We'll just give it a moment. Okay, I don't see anybody in the queue. Michelle, anybody on the phone that you can see?
No, there are no questions in queue.
Okay. All right. Any final comments, Phil, before we turn it over to the working group facilitators?
Well, you know what, Christina, thank you for asking, because I was going back looking at my notes, and there's one thing I really wanted to reinforce. I really felt that the value that we had with the working groups is actually the stakeholders themselves making presentations. And we heard a little bit of this from Mark and others this morning already, but gosh, we heard presentation from the California Air Resource Board, from the Washington regulatory agencies, whether it's the UTC or the Department of Ecology. We heard from Western Resource Advocates. I know I'm going to leave folks out, but WPTF as well. So just the fact that we had so many stakeholders giving us their presentations and well thought out concepts was really, really helpful. So just wanted to throw in that big thanks. And then Christina, back to you, and we can move on to our facilitators.
Thank you, Phil. All right. So yes, we do have some updates from the working group facilitators, starting with Mark Richardson. Mark, are you on?
Yep. Can you hear me, Christina?
Yes, thank you.
Do you mind going to the next slide for me? And then one more. All right. Good morning, and thank you all for your time this morning. My name is Mark Richardson, and I am the Working Group 1 facilitator for the Resource Efficiency and Supply Commitment Working Group. In the coming slides, I want to cover briefly the purpose of the resource efficiency evaluation, highlight many of the elements our group discussed, and provide a preview into the RSE framework that is starting to take shape. Please note, I will pause at the end for any questions the audience may have. So with that, let me get started. One of the foundational elements to implement a successful extended day-ahead market is the resource efficiency evaluation. The purpose of the RSE is to ensure that each EDAM BAA submits sufficient supply schedules into the day-ahead market to meet their own individual capacity, flexibility, and other balancing authority area obligations based on conditions expected in that day-ahead timeframe. The working group has kept the underlying primary objective in our preview all along and has been committed to designing an equitable and comprehensive sufficiency evaluation for all participating EDAM entities. Our working group has had a high level of engagement and participation throughout the meetings, with many stakeholders sharing ideas, perspectives, offering additional considerations, and even presenting on key discrete elements to help spur conversation. Through the process, a need was identified for our group to have additional discussions on elements that were not originally identified as in scope. As an example, the ISO provided a comprehensive overview on the residual unit commitment and convergence bidding processes to understand how these concepts work today and how they may play a critical role in the context of EDAM. Let's go to the next slide, please, Christina. This slide should look familiar as it originated back in December and was brought back to this audience in February to help illustrate the progress and accomplishments this group has achieved. I have added yellow stars here to indicate the different elements and topics this group has discussed in detail over the past 10-11 weeks. I want to acknowledge and take stock that we covered several complex items, and through discussions, there was a ton of meaningful progress made that will ultimately help inform the development of a straw proposal. During discussions on these topics, I believe the group developed a common understanding of the different issues and nuances underlying each one of these elements. Some of these elements were naturally discussed in more detail than others based on their level of complexity and where the conversation naturally led the group. For example, items like resource qualification and counting rule details took several working group sessions to vet the numerous constraints for the evaluation to consider to help ensure we were not giving too much credit or too little credit to a BAA towards passing the evaluation based on the various resource characteristics that make up the resource fleet. Whereas items like the timing of the RFC runs quickly landed on a need to provide the EDAM entity the ability to frequently evaluate for sufficiency prior to that 9 a.m. scheduled run so that they can ensure they are taking necessary steps towards becoming sufficient. While we did not go through all the scope topics originally identified, such as common AS or reserve rules and treatment of existing reserve sharing group obligations, I do think overall we made great progress. As you can see here, we also added some scope items like the RUC and convergence bidding topics that the group felt were necessary and important to be discussed. Next slide, please, Christina. So, through the working group discussions, I have started noticing some framework elements coming to fruition for the resource sufficiency evaluation. I think the group can agree, in general, understanding that the minute details may still need to be worked out, that the EDAM RFC is starting to shape up like the following. The day-ahead sufficiency evaluation will be at the BAA level across the full 24-hour horizon that is based on hourly demand, some level of reserves, and the associated BAA's uncertainty needs. The evaluation will need to ensure the overall capacity and flexibility needs are being met for that BAA. The evaluation will utilize the most accurate forecast, whether that's provided by the EDAM entity or the ISO itself. Prior to 10 a.m., when the day-ahead market closes and that binding RFC evaluation kicks off, as I mentioned on the previous slide, we heard a need through the working group to allow for entities to have that ability to execute those advisory sufficiency tests themselves to provide them with confidence that they are working towards meeting their own obligations and passing the RFC. The actual evaluation itself may end up being a sufficiency optimization model that utilizes the submitted resource energy bid range, not including bid prices, that calculates for each EDAM BAA a feasible and adequate hourly reserve schedule over the trading day to determine the optimal resource sufficiency portfolio. The primary objective of this framework is to minimize hourly failures and to appropriately account for the different resource constraints to ensure resources are not being under or overly accredited. Next slide, please. Thank you. We also spent considerable time on these elements you see here as a group and can agree that there is a need for these elements to be recognized by the ultimate framework that ends up being developed. The group discussed elements like how to treat, what level of qualification, and overall firmness pertaining to the different types of import arrangements, such as WSPP Schedule Cs, understanding that they are widely utilized and relied upon across the West, and that the RSC framework needs to ensure to consider them. The group spent a few sessions discussing how the application of consequences for failure to pass the RSC need to be heavy enough to incent the failing entity to work towards becoming sufficient, but not so punitive to undermine the overall EDAM benefits. These discussions included the fact that we may not want to limit or freeze transfers in the day-ahead timeframe to ensure we are taking advantage of the diverse resource pool that EDAM offers, but potentially utilize some level of financial consequences that may increase based on frequency or magnitude of failure. Now, this last item here was probably one of the most challenging topics. It was important for the working group to build up the foundation of the evaluation prior to diving into discussions on the confidence and certainty in EDAM transfers. To help start conversations, the group went through numerous examples that SRP provided. These examples help illustrate how the market could or would address certain situations that may materialize in stress system conditions. This included a number of edge case emergency conditions that put forward the ultimate question: what level of priority do transfers need to have? I do not believe we developed consensus, but we did develop a strong understanding on this topic and how EDAM can assist in these tight system conditions by having a broader footprint. I believe the criticality and importance of certainty and confidence in EDAM transfers cannot be understated, and the group understands that. While we made a ton of substantive progress up to now and have a great starting point, I do want to acknowledge there's still some work to be accomplished through the stakeholder process to help inform and develop what the RFC may end up looking like. Prior to opening up for questions, I again wanted to truly thank the stakeholder community for their willingness to speak up, share their perspectives and ideas in these forums. The collaborative nature and engagement these past 10, 11 weeks have been nothing short of amazing and is a true accomplishment within itself. So a big thank you from me to everyone for your engagement. All right, let me pause there. It looks like my machine crashed, so hopefully everyone can hear me still. And let me see if there's any questions for Working Group 1.
And we can hear you, Mark. So thank you. Just lost your video. So again, if you have any questions and you logged into WebEx, you're going to want to use the hand icon located above the chat window. If you just dialed into the meeting, please press #2.
So Christina, I cannot see the WebEx, so you'll have to help me if there's some hands raised.
Yeah, I'm just giving a moment. I don't see anybody yet, but just want to give people a little time to queue up.
There are no questions that I can see either, Christina.
Okay. Yeah, there'll be other opportunities to ask questions. So we can go ahead and move to Deb Levine for the Working Group 2 update. And then if anybody has questions for Mark, of course, we can go back. Oh,
absolutely.
Looks like you. So let's go ahead and open Alva's line. And Alva, just you can also state your affiliation. That would be appreciated.
Thank you. This is Alva Svoboda, PG&E. Just one question for you, Mark, in terms of how you'll be moving this forward. I think it kind of relates to some of the others as well. Will you be providing? You sort of presented this in terms of moving towards and converging. Will you be presenting? It sounded to me like in some cases there were multiple options being presented. Do you sort of intend to present it in that way as well? That was just my only question, really.
Yeah, I think as Melos, thank you for the question, Alva. I hope your morning's going well. And again, thank you for your engagement through the working group. Your feedback was fantastic. I think as Melos mentioned, to the extent there are some items that had multiple options, you will see those put forward in the straw proposal.
Great, very good. Thank you.
Yeah, and Alva, this is Milos. I'll just jump in. I'll talk a little bit more about this once we get towards the latter part of the presentation. But like Mark said, if we didn't have options, but there are a number of concepts that we've heard, I think you'll see us tease those out as well in the straw proposal, just to allow room for the provision of more formal comment and perspectives on different concepts that we may have heard in the working group. So great question.
That's terrific. Thank you. That'll really help in terms of bringing it back from the organizations that we're representing. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions?
I'm not seeing anybody else in the queue, but as I mentioned, if you do have a question for Mark later, he's happy to address it. So let's go ahead and move to Levine's update. Deb, go ahead.
All right.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Christina. Good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Deb Levine. I'm the Director of Infrastructure Contracts and Management at the CAISO, and I was the facilitator for Working Group 2, Transmission Commitment and Congestion Rents. Working Group 2 typically had over 120 people participating at each of the 20 meetings that provided an open and transparent opportunity to discuss the EDAM transmission issues. And I greatly appreciate the comments, perspectives, and candor that everybody brought to the meetings. The number of ideas and concepts discussed allowed for a common understanding of the issues the work group was facing. In addition, stakeholders were provided an opportunity to submit written comments on some specific questions that the ISO had posed. We just received those on Monday of this week, and we are still going through them, but we will go ahead and incorporate those ideas and evaluate them for the straw proposal. While the working group was fast-moving, the discussions garnered information that will allow the ISO to draft a straw proposal that will continue the process of development of EDAM. I also want to specifically thank Vistra for putting forward concepts that were outside of the box, but definitely food for thought. Next slide, please. So the purpose of Working Group 2 was to define how transmission is made available to support the EDAM transfers and the associated compensation. A transfer is the transmission that goes between two EDAM balancing authority areas. In addition to that, as part of EDAM, you'll also have internal transmission, and the internal transmission will be optimized based on the full network model, but it's not part of the transfers between the EDAM entities. And we're also looking to try and find a opportunity to maximize the amount of transmission that can be optimized in EDAM while respecting the existing transmission rights. Next slide, please. At the onset, the working group had a number of design elements that were identified. And I'm happy to say, like Mark's chart, this is similar to what we had at our February meeting. We were able to touch on each one of the areas and each one of the design components that we originally started with. So we talked about the various concepts associated with availability, timing and duration, compensation, and congestion rent allocation. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. The framework that is emerging is not a consensus, but a common understanding of the issues and a potential way to start EDAM. Similar to the CAISO market, where we started in 1998, is not where we are today. And EDAM will need to take the same evolutionary path to improve the market as it grows in both time and membership. Internal transmission, as I just said, will be modeled in the full network model, and all existing contracts will be respected. Transmission at the interface to the EDAM BAAs is where the benefit will be realized, so we want to increase the pool of transmission that is available for optimization. So for bucket one will consist of that transmission that is going to support the resource efficiency evaluation capacity. And since that transmission has already been paid for, both by the entity purchasing it from the generator and or potentially the generator selling it to a load, that type of generation will be included in EDAM at what's called a hurdle-free, which in essence means there's no additional transmission charge associated with it, but it will be eligible for congestion rent. So to the extent that the LMP is different on the two sides of the balancing of their authority area at the transfer point, if there's a difference, then there'll be a congestion rent associated with that difference. Bucket two is transmission that will be made voluntarily available that has already been paid for, that it might be part of a OAK contract that the transmission provider knows. Let's say the contract is for 300 megawatts for the entire year. But the transmission provider knows that the entity only uses 200 megawatts during the winter time. So they could make that additional transmission available because it's already been paid for. It also would be hurdle-free, but eligible for congestion rents. We did have a discussion in the work group as to whether that transmission should truly be made hurdle-free or whether it should be part of bucket 3 that allows transmission to be sold at a hurdle rate or allow a hurdle rate to be added to bucket 2 to the extent that it is being made voluntarily available, but not necessarily by a transmission provider. And then bucket 3 is intended to be unsold, unreserved, firm, available transfer capability at the time of the start of the day-ahead market, which is 10 a.m. That would be made available by the transmission provider, and that would have, in essence, what was agreed to by the group, an OAT rate or potentially a discounted OAT rate. Next slide, please. Since the ISO sells their transmission as part of the market optimization, we don't have a robust advanced transmission market. So the concept of matching the transfer capacity that could be not self-scheduled at EDAM boundaries was discussed. There was a number of pros and cons, and additional analysis needs to be completed to determine how this concept would work, but it was definitely something that was discussed within the working group as a way for the ISO, at least, to start out to allow some of our transfer capacity as an export from the CAISO to go to the other EDAM entities. I imagine as part of the EDAM stakeholder process that will start after this, there'll be further discussions on the consideration of matching transfer capacity and also potentially having matching transfer capacity between other EDAM entities. And as far as the compensation approach is concerned, where we ended up was considering congestion rents for bucket 1 and bucket 2, and then discussing the various options for hurdle rates for bucket 3. There are some entities that do not have discounted rates in their OATs and some entities that do. So there'll have to be a consistency across all of the EDAM BAAs as to what the pricing would be for bucket 3 transmission. And lastly, we went ahead and considered what would, how intertie bidding framework would be used in the Western EIM today, which is not used, but how would we use it in EDAM? So at this point in time, the CAISO intends on retaining the intertie bidding at its interfaces, but understands the concerns that are raised by the other EDAM BAAs about free riding of transmission on their balancing authority areas to the extent they're trying to get to another balancing authority area. So intertie bidding will definitely be one of the issues that is going to be discussed further in the straw proposal. So again, I would like to personally thank everyone who participated in the over 40 hours in 11 weeks of working group number 2, and look forward to seeing how our ideas and discussions come to fruition. Next slide, please. So with that, I'd like to open up to any questions or comments that people had regarding working group number 2.
And if you do have a question or comment, you can use the hand icon above the chat window if you logged into WebEx, or if you just dialed in, you want to press #2 on your phone. And it does look like we do have someone in the queue. Michelle, please open their line. Steve, is your line open? So, there you go.
Yeah. Steve Greenley, Brookfield. First, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank you, Deb, and Mark and Kevin for the excellent job you guys did facilitating all three working groups, and obviously the contributions of staff in particular, Milos and Phil, and I would ask that I hope you have George stashed away in a safe somewhere, but anyway, great job, truly an effort in herding feral cats with a bunch of mice running around the floor. So kudos to you guys. One question I have, and I think it's particularly applicable to Group 2, Deb, is just, clearly, and I think you mentioned there'd be a
Steve, you got muted.
Nope.
Okay, now you're on.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Sorry. A need for consistency across, in the treatment across the entire EDAM footprint. So just, and maybe not to put some of the EDAM entity BAs on the spot, but I appreciate the thoughts of, like Dave Rubin or Kevin Smith or Kathy Anderson, just on how they anticipate, because you guys did a great job laying out how you see the EDAM stakeholder process playing out over the next year. Obviously, there's going to have to be complementary changes made to OATS, which I would imagine each entity is going to have to conduct its own kind of process to vet those. So maybe you could just talk a little bit on, not that it's the ISO's job to coordinate that, but your thinking on that. And maybe the reality is those OAT processes and changes can't come till the end of the process, or near the end, once the CISO structure, the overall EDAM structure is kind of defined better. But there's going to be a need, I think, to ensure some level of consistency. And this, goes to particular issues in Group 2 with respect to the use of unscheduled transmission and how that's made available by the transmission service provider or not, depending on their comfort level on the firmness, rolling from the day ahead into real time. But it also, percolates into other issues, for example, in Group 1 on applicability and use of RUC and convergence bidding, and of course, intertie bidding. So maybe if you guys at some point, it can be at the end, just talk a little bit about that coordination with the other EDAM entities on those changes, if you have any thoughts on that. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, Steve, thanks so much. Good question. What we had talked about early on in the Working Group 2 process, when the presentation was given by Kathy Anderson of where the EDAM entities had proposed to go with the transmission, the discussion ended up with the EDAM concept needs to be more flushed out and much more defined before each one of the entities that is going to join EDAM can then tackle their oaths. It is anticipated that the oaths will need to be changed, but we need to be a little bit further down the road on the different concepts so that they know how to change their Milos, did you want to add anything else?
Yeah, thanks, Deb. No, great response and great question, Steve. Let me maybe tackle, I think you had two different questions on that topic of the oaths. As Debbie said, I think what we're expecting is, we need to put forward the complete and comprehensive design of the EDAM in order for the entities ultimately to consider through their own stakeholder processes and discussions with their own stakeholders, ultimately of whether they're willing and able to join EDAM based on that framework design, and what tariff changes they may need themselves ultimately to join EDAM and implement some of the concepts of EDAM design. I think you make a great point, Steve, that one of the things that we heard, particularly in Working Group 2, is the concept of, a common market design such that it potentially in certain key areas, as to how transmission is made available, some of these other related elements, that it provides, the market provides that common design so that everybody is kind of on a level playing field, and that there's some level of discretion, in what type of transmission is made available. That's kind of not in place, but rather there's a common design of how transmission is made available to the EDAM, and that common design be applicable across the EDAM footprint. So we've heard some of those discussions, and we're very mindful of those points and the consideration of common rules that apply commonly that potentially remove some discretion in certain areas. But we do also recognize that there may be a need for discretion by each EDAM entity in some components. So I hope that as we go through this process, we can continue fleshing that further out, and that market design with stakeholder input, and ultimately, like I said, the entities the willing entities are ultimately going to, based on that design, have to conduct their own stakeholder processes in determining whether they will be joining the EDAM. But we hope to work collaboratively with those entities and with all interested parties throughout the process, so that some of that process can potentially take place through our stakeholder process, by having everybody informed and aware of the design fairly early on, and that it hopefully decreases the process time on their end in discussing those concepts with their stakeholders. But I do see that their OAT design and OAT changes and OAT discussions, those will have to happen separately among the entities that are willing to join the EDAM. So hopefully that addresses your questions, Steve.
It does. Thank you both. And it makes perfect sense. And, obviously there's a challenge. You don't want those processes to be serial such that, it's all made kind of after the fact, just because it can complicate, I would think, overall implementation schedules. But nonetheless, I guess a request perhaps maybe for the CAISO at certain touch points through the process kind of coordinates and we get updates from, it's very hard to change. You're talking potentially quite a number of potential OAT changes with their own processes, and not that it's on the CAISO to kind of do that for us, but I guess I would request just coordination with the EDAM entities just on anticipation of when those processes may kick off and a need for kind of coordination. But I'll stop there and thank you guys again. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, we'll go to Kevin next.
Hey, everyone. This is Kevin Head.
Sorry.
The other Kevin. Sorry, Kevin Head. Kevin Smith, I'll let you go first.
No, go ahead, Kevin Smith.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Kevin
Okay,
Smith.
sorry about that. We got a little confusion there. Sorry. Kevin Smith with Bank. I just wanted to echo Steve's commendation of you guys. You did a great job, I think, and it literally was a feral cat exercise. I know it was hard, but it was a good process, and of course it's just starting. As we know, there's a lot that's going to get done now, and there'll be a stakeholder process ahead of it. But I want to echo for all the folks that have facilitated and so forth, done a really good job. Just the one issue I wanted to note is back on the prior slide on 22. When we're talking about emerging framework design, I know Dave Rubin and I kind of kicked open this concept of maybe a non-pancaked or uniform rate. And I'm not saying that will emerge, but we're certainly trying to think outside of this pancake rate issue. And, we'd like to, entertain maybe things that are a little out of the original box, because things have come to light in which again, credit to the process, because we never claimed that we had dug really deeply into every issue. And I think the bucket 3 started as something I thought was pretty straightforward and simple, as we started to look in through discussions with Jeff Nelson and others who have raised issues, this reciprocity issue and other things started to emerge, and we did look at it primarily through the lens of the EDAM entity, the non-ISO EDAM entities, and so I just think we need to probably leave room in there for some other concepts that might be thought through by stakeholders or others. So that's my comment. But again, thanks for all the hard work and efforts that have gone into it.
Thanks, Kevin. Appreciate that. All right. With that, operator, if you could forward it 2 slides.
Yeah, that's Christina. I'll do that.
Okay. All right. I'll turn it over to Kevin Head. Kevin?
Thanks, Christina. Hey, everybody. Thanks for giving me a little bit of time to speak today. I'm Kevin Head. I'm was the working group facilitator for working group 3. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what we accomplished in the working group. So the next slide has a couple of bullets that I wanted to hit. So the purpose of this working group was to develop an approach to account for the costs and reporting requirements arising from state greenhouse gas reduction policies. And it really had 2 key elements in my mind. One was, how do we factor in the costs arising from carbon pricing policies into the market optimization for the extended day-ahead market? And then the second was, how could the EDAM support the state greenhouse gas reduction programs and reporting requirements? And we really had a great, robust engagement from a lot of different working group participants. In particular, we heard some good outside perspectives from the California Air Resources Board, from the Washington Department of Ecology and the Washington UTC. And these presentations really helped us understand how the programs that those entities administer might impact the design of this element of the extended day-ahead market. We also heard from Western resource advocates on the potential for a West-wide all-generation tracking system. And then as far as the administration of the working group, about midway through, we took the opportunity to submit some homework assignments. And this homework assignment was asking the working group participants to share their open questions that they had on the 2 frameworks that were emerging. And that allowed us to see what the open topics in folks' minds were. We then took those and revised the scope document that we had been working on and came up with a 2.0 version of each of the 2 approaches. We also did a little bit of a qualitative analysis on the resource-specific approach. We didn't have time to do that for the unspecified or zonal approach because we were more focused on filling in the details of that approach. The next slide shows the progress that we made in the greenhouse gas accounting topic. Almost all of these design elements were vetted in detail during the working group. You'll notice that this slide looks a little bit different than Deb and Mark's, just because I wanted to make sure that we differentially tracked the resource-specific approach and the unspecified approach. Fortunately, we did cover a lot of ground on both of those approaches. In terms of the general accounting topic, we talked about all of these for both approaches. One thing I'd like to highlight is in a situation where Washington State and California will have 2 separate greenhouse gas accounting cap and trade and cap and invest programs, and they're going to be unlinked at the beginning of EDAM. We'll effectively have to have 2 separate greenhouse gas zones because of the 2 different carbon prices that will arise in those areas. And I'm glad that we were able to discuss both of those in the context, how both approaches might handle those situations. So moving on to reporting and settlements, it appeared that the group was leaning towards an approach where the entity bearing the compliance obligation, as determined by the state regulator, would also be the entity that receives the greenhouse gas revenue, so as to make them whole and give them the ability to procure and retire allowances under those programs. It's important to note that in those conversations, we were really only capable of exploring hypothetical situations of which entity might bear the compliance obligation, because ultimately any decision on this matter will be subject to California Resources Board, Washington Department of Ecology, or some other entity's jurisdictional authority. We couldn't presume that anything suggested in the CAISO's working group process and straw proposal, et cetera, would ultimately be approved by those agencies. However, we did tease out the link between the compliance and reporting obligations and the way that those transactions would be financially settled. Moving on to these approach-specific issues. So these are topics that are specific to one approach or the other. We talked a little bit about the baseline for greenhouse gas attribution. And we heard two approaches, but didn't reach a resolution on which would ultimately be preferred. And we heard a lot of interest in having some data analysis regarding the two variations that I'll get into a little bit further detail in a moment to help support the decision-making process by the stakeholder community. In terms of the unspecified or zonal approach, we discussed the source-specific pathways to serve the greenhouse gas zone. And again, I'll get into details to what that means in a little bit, but we weren't able to close this topic out, particularly how a scheduling coordinator in the non-greenhouse gas zone may elect on a shorter-term basis to serve the greenhouse gas zone directly. And then finally, in terms of these miscellaneous topics, the one that I wanted to highlight was the effects on WEIM. And it was generally agreed that for whatever approach is decided upon in the EDAM, we would likely also apply that approach to the WEIM's real-time market as well. The last slide covers the framework that's emerging. And really, we've had two approaches on the table and continue to do so. The first is this resource-specific approach, and that's largely an extension of the WEIM design that's in place today. And this is where the market would co-optimize based on greenhouse gas bids that are submitted by scheduling coordinators, as well as the energy bids submitted by those scheduling coordinators. Then, based on the economics, the market would then deem certain resources generation as having served the greenhouse gas zone or not. Some things that I'd like to highlight is we heard about two potential variations to this approach that differed in how they would calculate the amount of megawatts that could be deemed to serve the greenhouse gas zone. The first variation was using the results of the RSE optimization that we heard a little bit about earlier, and then that would serve as the baseline for greenhouse gas attribution. The second potential variation was presented by WPTF, and they proposed using an optimized baseline and then limiting the megawatt attribution to the incremental dispatch above that optimized baseline in an attempt to kind of target that secondary dispatch issue. Some concerns were raised about the market efficiency of such a design, but it appeared that further analysis and consideration was desired by broadly the stakeholder community. We also talked about some new design features that would be incorporated into the resource-specific approach, such as limiting the megawatts that could be attributed to the greenhouse gas zone based on hourly net export from the non-GHG zone in question. We also performed an evaluation of this approach against some design objectives that we had agreed upon and workshopped early on in the process. And during that evaluation, we heard some concerns raised about this approach not sufficiently limiting secondary dispatch, even after the improvements that I mentioned were discussed. I'll move on to the unspecified or zonal approach. And this was initially raised by PowerX and the public generating pool, who spent a lot of time behind the scenes putting together this concept and the materials for these two presentations. And so we really appreciate them doing that. The working group then picked up the ball on this approach and made it its own, which I was glad to see. As mentioned before, we heard about some source-specific pathway. Oh, well, let me give a little bit of background as to how this approach works. So the way this works is the market optimizes by allowing transfers from the non-greenhouse gas zone, the areas where there isn't a carbon pricing policy, into the greenhouse gas zones if the price differential is sufficiently high. And that price differential, the amount that it would have to clear, something we called a hurdle rate, different than the hurdle rate that Deb was talking about. And we also heard about some source-specific pathways that could be used by generating resources that want to serve the greenhouse gas zone directly without clearing that hurdle. And there were effectively two alternatives discussed in terms of how that might work. The first was a longer-term commitment where a resource that's physically located in the non-greenhouse gas zone would effectively be considered in the greenhouse gas zone based on their contractual commitment. And then a shorter-term pathway that would allow them to make that election more frequently. But as I mentioned, we weren't able to close out the mechanics of this shorter-term approach. We also had a really good conversation on the hurdle rate calculation yesterday. Again, this is the price differential that needs to be overcome to allow transfers between the zones, or more specifically from the non-greenhouse gas zone to the greenhouse gas zone. The initial assumption was that the hurdle rate would be a product of the emissions rate and an allowance price. From my perspective, I didn't hear much disagreement on this general structure, but we did get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty on the emissions rate to be used, and two ideas, at least two options were raised. One would just be kind of a static rate based on an unspecified emissions rate used by the California and Washington regulators, or a more dynamic or shaped emissions rate, which is based on a marginal resource by hour. And in this case, it was noted that this decision would likely need to be made by the state regulatory bodies, similar to this next topic that I'll talk about, because we want to make sure that the resources that are clearing the hurdle rate are sufficiently compensated for the obligations that they might have. Moving on to compliance reporting and settlements, we discussed several hypothetical situations here. It's uncertain whether the unspecified approach would imply that regulatory changes are needed, and if regulatory changes were implied, it's also uncertain whether the rulemaking processes of the respective state agencies would ultimately result in the required changes from this approach being adopted. That being said, I think we really were able to get a lot of detail around how settlements might work under various situations as they arise from these rulemaking processes of these state entities. So that's kind of all I had in terms of the emerging framework and design. I'm happy to open it up to questions. So Christina, do we have anybody in the queue?
Not yet, but if you do have a question, you can use the hand icon above the chat window, or if you dialed in, you'll want to press pound 2 on your phone. Just giving it a moment, Kevin. I'm not seeing anybody yet.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not seeing any questions or anybody in the queue.
Okay.
But, you know, we do have some time, so if anybody does come up with a question, of course, raise your hand and we'll go back if needed. Milos, I don't think Therese is on yet, so do you want to go ahead and review the straw proposal publication timeline, and then we can go back to Therese when she joins?
Yeah, thanks, Christina. Let's do that if possible.
Yeah, one moment. Looks like DJ Satyal's in the queue, so we'll go to DJ.
Kevin, Vijay with WRA, Vijay Satyal. Thanks, Kevin, for all your work. Phenomenal effort. You still have all your hair intact. I would have had white hair by now. On the unspecified approach, as you yourself acknowledged that and I appreciate the PGP PowerX team coming up with ideas and the amendment to it by WPTF in a way. Since that's not fully fleshed out with the exercise the way you did the resource specific, is there value or need in 1 or 2 additional work group session just to come to some kind of more clarity on it? Or are you going to have both the proposals, both the methodologies going into the policy proposal coming out to seek response? I'm just trying to understand, would there be a coming to Jesus, no offense to anyone, on one proposal only with one methodology, or there's going to be more clarity, and then we can talk a bit more about emission rates offline. But thank you. And thanks again for all your work. the whole
Yeah.
team.
Thanks, Vijay. I'll respond to the first one. I think that we can have some offline conversations about the unspecified or zonal approach, but I don't think that we'll be engaging in a full-fledged working group like we had just completed. And I can confirm that both proposals, the unspecified approach or the unspecified or zonal approach and the resource-specific approach, will both be in the STRA proposal. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, it does. Thank you. That helps a lot.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and thanks just again to WPTF and PowerX and PGP, who all put in a lot of work into their presentations, as did WRA and the state regulators. So thanks everybody who took the time to participate in the working group.
Thank you, Kevin. I don't see anybody else in the queue. Milos, we'll go ahead and go to your update, and then we can go back to Teresa when she joins.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Christina. And yeah, we'll go back to Teresa. There's a parallel meeting at this time with the GRC, and she's the chair. So we have her slated around 10:30. We're a bit early, so I'll start with my section. If you wouldn't mind, Christina, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I wanted to spend a little bit of time just to talk about the STRA proposal, and we've touched on it already, I think, in earlier sections, but just to reiterate a few things and you know, what to expect in the STRA proposal. I do want to acknowledge that, you know, while we have been through a fairly intense 2.5 months of working group meetings, you know, as we mentioned earlier, 60 working group meetings, 120 hours, we're still fairly early on in the stakeholder process, and I want us to keep that in mind as well. I think we put a lot of time and effort and ideas and perspectives and concepts on the table, but now we have to synthesize all that into a comprehensive STRA proposal and really see and discuss with stakeholders across the next proposals how do all of these pieces fit together, and how best to fit all of these pieces together. The working groups have provided really great ideas, great perspectives to help shape that initial comprehensive proposal. We've heard from, like I think we mentioned across the working groups, we've heard from a number of different stakeholders. They've shared their perspectives. We've also heard from stakeholders that have taken the time to present at those meetings and develop ideas that they've put on the table for further vetting, and we're certainly appreciative of that. I do want to acknowledge a couple of other entities that I don't know that we mentioned as we were going through the working group discussions, but I also do want to acknowledge that we've heard from Idaho Power, NVE, and Bank. They've put together a presentation early on in the process about transmission, and they're thinking about how transmission can be made available to the EDAM. I also want to acknowledge Salt River Project, SRP, for their effort, particularly in Working Group 1 here in the last couple of meetings, of putting forward ideas and perspectives and examples to help us walk through certain key aspects of the discussion on the confidence in EDAM transfer. So, and I think we've acknowledged and recognized that a lot of other stakeholders presented, and I think we've covered all of those across the different working groups. But just a tremendous effort and tremendous outpouring of ideas and perspectives, and really stakeholders that put in time into this. And I want to assure folks that we do take those seriously. We have considered them throughout the discussions, and we will find a way to weave some of those concepts into the STRA proposal for consideration. The way that I envision the STRA proposal being laid out is, especially because we're in this early stage of the process, I think we're going to have discrete areas where there is going to be a kind of uniform proposal that we've thought through based on discussions in the working group. But I do envision that there are also going to be sections of the proposal where we're considering different options, but also putting out concepts for consideration that we've heard in the working groups. We've heard a number of different discrete options that were put on the table, particularly that Kevin covered in his working group 3, discrete options that have been fleshed out to a certain level that we can now broaden them more, consider them more broadly with stakeholders. But we've also heard across other groups concepts that maybe we didn't have an opportunity to flesh them out more broadly, but I think we've had enough of a common understanding around those concepts that I think we can look to put some additional detail to those and put them out for consideration in that STRA proposal for stakeholders to more formally comment on these. So that's how I envision us taking that input from the working groups in helping shape discrete proposal areas, putting out options on the table for consideration and more formal comment, but also putting out concepts that we've heard that maybe we didn't, again, flesh out fully in the working groups, but we have enough of an understanding on it that I think they'll be worthwhile to continue considering through the straw proposal and subsequent iterations of that straw proposal. I noted also this at the beginning, that I think through the working groups, it's a new process for us, and I think we're in better shape having had the working groups in place, having 2.5 months of these robust discussions, that I think we're in better position to put together a more comprehensive straw proposal than if we didn't have those working groups. I think the working groups have shaped our understanding of certain concepts. I think they've shaped the understanding of other stakeholders as well, different concepts and different pieces, and how all of these may or have to fit together. But I think we're in a better shape to put together a straw proposal, having developed that common understanding of issues amongst all ourselves, that I think it will allow for more robust and more constructive formal comments to aspects of the straw proposal, and I think will allow us and brought us some valuable information that we can use as we move forward in that stakeholder process. I think absent the working groups, I think we could probably not develop a comprehensive straw proposal because just of the myriad of new issues that we may not have been able to tease out for stakeholders to develop that common understanding. So I do want to commend stakeholders for, again, the time and effort that they put into this. I think it's really provided us a lot of helpful information that I think will be very useful as we move through the stakeholder process, and it will help us and I think all the stakeholders in providing more constructive and informed feedback to different elements that we may put forward. I expect that the straw proposal, as I mentioned earlier, I expect it to be fairly lengthy straw proposal, reflecting the breadth of issues that we've covered in the working groups. You've heard from the facilitators today, particularly those slides of the different tables. We have covered a lot of ground and a lot of different topics. Maybe we didn't do as great of a job kind of in identifying these working groups, how all of these pieces fit together. But I think across the 3 working groups, we've put out enough information. We've developed that common understanding that I think now the ISO team can go back and try to fit these pieces together and put those out in the straw proposal and really get that formal stakeholder feedback that will help us move to the next phase here and through iterations of straw proposals. I also think that there's, I think we've talked about this before, but I think there will be room for potentially reconvening some of these working groups throughout the rest of the stakeholder process as we move along through different iterations of the proposal. I think we found these working groups very fruitful. I think we'll learn a number of things through these working groups that I think we can apply in future working group discussions in this particular initiative. I think we're open to reconvening working groups, particularly, after the straw proposal on discrete concepts, discrete elements based on stakeholder feedback, and discrete aspects of the proposal that I think will bear a bit more fruit. And we can pace ourselves a little bit better there as well. And with some of that developed understanding from previous discussions, I think we can have more robust discussions in discrete areas as we go along in the stakeholder process. I think we're open as well as I know we have about, maybe a month, 5 weeks or so towards the publication of the straw proposal. I think we're open to potentially, as we start putting pen to paper into that straw proposal, we may be open to getting together ad hoc in a working group on a particular discrete topic, even before the straw proposal. I think we're open to that. As we convene internally and discuss some of these items, we may find a need for that. And so we're certainly open to that, and we'll let stakeholders know if we do decide to convene an ad hoc group on a particular discrete topic and engage the stakeholder community more broadly on some of these concepts and ideas ahead of the straw proposal. We're open to that, and like I said, we'll see how things develop as we put pen to paper now that the working groups have concluded. I also want to note and encourage stakeholders to continue thinking about these different issues and different concepts that have been discussed in the working groups. Now that the working groups have concluded, we're going to definitely think more broadly and deeply about some of these issues as we put together some of the additional detail that needs to go into the straw proposal. but I think I encourage stakeholders to do the same on a number of these concepts. And it may lend itself better on some topics than others, but if you really believe strongly in a particular concept that was raised at the working groups, you feel that it has merit or it needs further development, I encourage you to continue having those discussions, and feel free to reach out to the ISO if there's some additional detail that you think you've developed or you can develop that it could help in moving the ball forward on some of those concepts. So I encourage the stakeholder community to continue to stay engaged and continue discussing some of these items. And hopefully now, with the working groups closing out, you have a little bit more time and not at such a frantic pace to consider some of those elements. So a little bit on the logistics front now. We're looking at the publication of the straw proposal the last week of April. We haven't yet settled on a particular date. We'll see as we put pen to paper, but we're targeting that week for publication of that straw proposal. And then a stakeholder meeting 2 or 3 weeks after that. We're targeting the week of the 15th to give us enough time to put together materials, to have a robust discussion, and to be able to synthesize some of the concepts of that straw proposal into slides that we can have a more robust discussion in those stakeholder meetings. I envision that we will have probably need 2 days of stakeholder meetings to be able to discuss that comprehensive straw proposal and the different elements of that straw proposal. So that's what we're targeting as well. And as we settle on those dates, we will be issuing a market notice identifying and asking stakeholders to book that time to join us for the discussion. And then, as I mentioned a bit earlier, because we acknowledge that this is a comprehensive straw proposal that is going to likely be very lengthy and is going to cover a breadth of issues, we recognize the need for an extended comment period. And so usually I think our comment period is roughly 3 weeks or so. We've extended it here to 5 weeks, the week of May 30th, depending on the final publication date of the straw proposal. But as we start putting, again, pen to paper and start comprehensively capturing the straw proposal, we're certainly open to potentially providing some additional time if necessary for comments. We recognize we need the time to put together the straw proposal, and likely you need the time as well to digest a very lengthy straw proposal. So we're very mindful of that and open to adjusting these timelines as needed. I think getting a good understanding at the onset, coming out of the working groups and through the straw proposal, will set us up well for the future iterations. And hopefully as we move through the iterations of the proposals, we're honing down on certain issues and narrowing, from potentially a set of concepts to consider, narrowing down to a more, concrete proposal in areas where we may not have that at the straw proposal phase. So, we recognize this is we're moving fairly quickly. We're putting together that comprehensive straw proposal, and we thank you again for all the effort and encourage you to stay engaged with us. We're open if you have any additional feedback and input on certain components and concepts that were discussed in the working groups. If you want to, get together with us and share some additional perspectives, we're certainly open to that. We may reach out to some stakeholders to seek some feedback or perspectives on concepts that they may have introduced in the working groups that we may want to vet further. We may reach out to make sure that we have captured that common understanding of the topic and appropriately captured it in the straw proposal. So I envision that, we're fairly open to getting together with stakeholders if they have any additional concepts or ideas that they want to enhance based on what they presented in the working groups. And like I said, we may reach out as well to make sure that we've captured some of these ideas and concepts accurately in the straw proposal as well. So let me pause there and see if there are any questions when it comes to the straw proposal and the path to getting there. Open to any questions, and then hopefully after this, we can turn it over to Therese to talk about the GRC, and if time is left at the end, we can take even additional questions on anything that stakeholders have heard throughout the day today. So let me just pause here if there's a particular question, and then we can move to the next presentation.
Okay, it looks like Nelson jumped in the queue. Perfect. I see you back in the queue, Jeff. So we'll go to you first. Again, if you do have a question, you can select the hand icon above the chat window or press #2 on your phone if you just dialed in. So let's go ahead and go to Jeff Nelson.
Good morning. Again, I want to join people in thanking the ISO for this very extensive process and an opportunity to discuss a lot of very important issues. So thank you. Well done for the process. Just a thought on the white paper and the depth of it. You might want to consider rolling out similar groups and discussing the portions of the presentations with subteams, and maybe sort of rolling in comments rather than one big bang of comments on everything. If you could break it up into discrete pieces with sort of a walkthrough by the ISO on that discrete part, and then let people provide comments both after reading it and going through the walkthrough, maybe in the same teams we already had, maybe a better way to get focused and constructive feedback on that. Just a thought. Thank you again.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jeff. That's a great idea. Let us consider that as well. That's a good suggestion and good feedback. We'll definitely consider it. Appreciate it, Jeff.
All right, we'll go to Vijay.
Thank you. Milos, thank you for this update. I actually want to build on Jeff's comment in a slightly nuanced way, but Vijay Satya with WRA. I think it'd be valuable for each work groups as when you release the final straw proposal, if there is a debrief call associated with that proposal where you walk through what is the motivation behind anything new being proposed and the context to it, or what is the deal breaker, if that's possible, because that would be helpful for commenters to strategize where to really focus on and what to comment and save you 20, 30 emails of follow-up questions. What did you mean on page 19, or what do you mean here? So just a thought, not that for those who are very involved, they would know the content, but it'd still be valuable to have some contextual perspective if you were to do any debrief call right when you release the proposal. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you, Vijay. Great suggestion again. Let us take that back and consider it. I think it seems reasonable, but let us take back and see how we can achieve all that. I think we do want to have a comprehensive stakeholder meeting where we lay out the whole picture, but I do note that and recognize the potential benefit as well of maybe after that having some breakouts to more comprehensively walk through each individual section, at least related to the working group. So great suggestions. Let us take that back and consider it.
All right, let's see. Alva, we'll go to you next.
Hello, Milos. This is Alva Svoboda from PG&E again. I've also really appreciated the design process coming to it from a more skeptical position than most of the participants, because I come from the implementation side more than the design side and the policy side, and I've appreciated hearing the perspectives. But what I did want to ask is that at the point of the straw proposal, you do begin to inject, and I think George has done that very well, but I would like to see some detail in terms of things like knowledge of whether things can be implemented, actually, rather than just should they be implemented. In a sense, getting some sense that you know your vendors can deliver the systems that would be needed. And also an issue that has concerned me as we've gone through is what's the real market timing going to be? Is it going to change from the current CAISO market timing, or is it going to need to change? And I know these will not be final at that point because you'll still be considering options, but starting to look at some of those framing implementation concepts as well as the policy concepts in the straw proposal would be really helpful for us to evaluate.
No, thank you, Alva. Really appreciate that feedback. And I envision that as we put some of these concepts into the straw proposal, I envision us describing them, but also I think injecting some of that perspective as well, that, if there are any implementation or other challenges or drawbacks, trying to tease those out as well, and then seek stakeholder feedback on those concepts, considering some of our perspectives on, whether there may be some challenges or some drawbacks, or what are the pros and cons of some of these elements. So it will be more than just acknowledging, that there are certain concepts. I think you'll see us put some additional thought and some additional detail associated with those, raise questions to the extent that there's some additional detail needed in some areas. But I think you'll see us develop them, try to develop these a bit further and think through them, raise some concepts of, whether these are implementable, whether there's certain drawbacks that make them difficult to kind of mash together with other elements of the EDAM. So it'll be more than just acknowledging the concepts. I think you'll see us put in some additional perspectives on those concepts based on everything the discussions that we've heard, and we'll make sure that definitely we're tackling or identifying their implementation or other challenges that may make certain concepts potentially not viable or more viable than others.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
All right, I don't see anybody else in the queue. Any final comments before we hand it over to Therese Milos?
Yeah, I was planning on doing some closing comments, but since we're going to be short on time, just want to again thank everybody for bearing with us for these last 2.5 months. Really appreciate all your work and effort, and we look forward to continuing to work with all of you. Stay with us and continue to engage with us. We really appreciate your feedback, and we found these working group discussions very, very informative. So thank you again, and Christina, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Milos. And thank you, Therese Hampton. She's joined us today. Therese is the chair of the WEIM Governance Review Committee, and she's going to be providing an update on activities related to that effort. So thanks for joining us, Therese.
Hi, thanks for having me. So I just want to give an update on where we're at. And as a way of giving an update, I want to just remind everybody where we've been and what we're starting here. So as you recall, last year in August, we put forward a proposal, actually both in spring and last summer, we put forward proposals for modifications to governance for EIM. What was always within the scope of the GRC was the potential to put forward governance recommendations for EDAM if and when an EDAM market design came forward. And so last fall, the joint boards asked the GRC for an update and our thoughts about whether it was time to kind of reinitiate our efforts to address EDAM. We met and reported that we think it's really important that we recognize EDAM market design influences the governance considerations that we would be making, and so thought it was important for us to start and operate kind of in parallel with the market design. So in February, we held a public meeting where we provided some background on the mission of the GRC as it relates to the exploration of EDAM, and we posed 4 questions to stakeholders and asked for their comments. And the questions were around what do they think is in scope for the GRC relative to governance for EDAM, and a few other questions about our timing and our process and things that they would like us to consider. We received 16 sets of comments on March 9th, which was the deadline for comments. Thank you to all of those who submitted comments. They are really thoughtful and really helpful. And for anybody that maybe is on this call that didn't submit comments or hasn't been tracking, remember all of this is always on the CAISO Stakeholders Initiative webpage, so you can go and see all of those comments. The GRC members have been reading and reviewing those comments. We are using kind of a method that we used over the last 2 years where we've broken down into subgroups to really, it allows us to get a little deeper into each of the comments on each of the issues and we're beginning the process of identifying some options in response to those comments. We have, I think it came out just yesterday in a market notice, we have a general session meeting on March 31st where the GRC will get a briefing from this team, the EDAM market design team, so that the GRC members can kind of understand the state of market design. As many commenters suggested, and the GRC members have always believed, is that governance is informed by market design. They are related, and so we want to be sure we understand where the market design is headed and how that might influence some of the options that we consider. We also are looking at a meeting in the last week of April where we'd like to really engage with stakeholders in some different options on governance. So we are targeting a meeting the last week of April to have conversations about different options. And similar to what we did the last time, we would like for this to be, we want to hear from stakeholders and get some of their reactions before we put something down on paper in any type of straw proposal. So that's where we're at. I'm happy to take any questions from folks about where we're at or the process. The one thing I failed to mention in terms of where we've been from last year to now is we do have some new GRC members. We have a number of GRC members who either changed roles or retired from their position for different reasons, and so we have a number of new members. You can also see the GRC member list is on the web page, but actually some new membership has been fun and interesting for the GRC to kind of broaden our perspectives and get some additional insights into what we're doing.
Okay, any questions for Therese? Again, you can select the hand icon above the chat window, or if you just dialed in, press #2. And thank you, Therese. Appreciate the update. I'll just give it a moment. Okay, I don't see any questions, Therese. Thank you again. Really appreciate your time today.
Sure,
so
thank you.
Thank you. I'll review the next steps. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand. So as we mentioned earlier, the ISO will be sending out a survey soliciting your feedback on the working group process and structure. The survey will come from Joanne Serena, who is the Vice President of Stakeholder Engagement and Customer Experience. So look for that later today. We really do appreciate receiving your feedback on your experience participating in these working groups. It's important going forward to understand the value of the working groups as a way to further vet issues and develop policies. So we do thank you in advance for taking that survey and look forward to receiving your responses by April 1st. And as Therese mentioned, there will be an EDAM briefing at the WEIM Governance Review Committee public meeting on March 31st. The details for that meeting are on ISO's public calendar. And also, as Milos mentioned in the previous slide, we will be publishing the straw proposal in late April, followed by a stakeholder call, probably 2 days of meetings in mid-May. And there will be an opportunity for you to provide formal written comments on the proposal, and those will be due the last week of May. And then just provided a link here to where you can find the EDAM materials related to the initiative and the working group meetings. And then just one more thing I want to note. So we did announce earlier this week that we will be hosting our Stakeholder Symposium. It will be held on November 9th and 10th at the Safe Credit Union Convention Center, which is new. It's the Sacramento Convention Center that's been remodeled. So that's in downtown Sacramento. The last symposium that we hosted was pre-pandemic, so we are very excited to see all of you in person at this event in November. We are targeting to open the registration in May, and we'll issue a public notice once the registration site is available. And so for more information, you can find, there's a link on this slide here. So if you need additional information on the symposium, it's linked here. You can also submit questions to the symposium reg at CAISO.com mailbox if you do have any questions about the event. Thank you again for joining us today. We really appreciate and value your engagement in the EDAM stakeholder process and look forward to receiving your feedback in the working group survey that we'll be sending out shortly. So have a restful weekend, everyone, and thank you again.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.